the teacher is often one of the first people to identify that there is a need.
Those kids were pretty much pegged then as special ed kids, and there was no chance of them of getting out of that kind of an environment. So now that we have the inclusive environments, they're not isolated, they're not going to a separate school.
The benefits are that it really does give the opportunity for all of the students in that classroom to be able to benefit from the benefits of diversity. And the diversity that we happen to be talking about here is special education.
We're not only teaching kids with special needs, but we're teaching kids that are typically developing who are also learning acceptance and understanding and tolerance.
More than 6 million children with disabilities receive special education and related services in our schools each year. The United States government, through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or I.D.E.A., sets standards that ensure these services are made available in schools for all students.
As a classroom teacher, you're a pivotal part of the process by which your students receive services under this law. You are a collaborator, a communicator, and a facilitator of accommodations. You are the individual who, aside from the parent, has the most day-to-day connection with your students' progress towards their goals.
For most of our nation's history, public schools were allowed to exclude children with disabilities. Students with certain special needs were often sent to centralized institutions. Others had no educational opportunities at all outside the home. During the 1960s, federal legislation began to guarantee and protect the educational rights of children.
And in 1975, Congress first enacted the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I.D.E.A. It ensured that all children, including children with disabilities, had the right to receive a free, appropriate public education. The law has been revised many times. Congress passed the most recent amendments in December 2004, with final regulations published in August 2006.
The name of the law is now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. I.D.E.A. lists 14 categories of disabilities. They are autism, visual impairment including blindness, deafblindness, deafness, developmental delay, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, mental retardation, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, and traumatic brain injury.
Children with these disabilities have specific rights protected by law. These include a free, appropriate public education, which is sometimes referred to as FAPE.
The idea of public education is that it's an extension of democracy, and it's an extension of all children coming together for the opportunity to learn together and to understand the differences of a democracy and to work towards being able to go out and be productive citizens together. And this extends that to children with special needs.
Beyond setting the standards for special education, I.D.E.A. mandates how special education is funded. States must assure that a wide range of procedures and processes are in place in order to be eligible to receive funding under I.D.E.A.
Each state must specify and implement certain requirements concerning dispute resolution, children with disabilities in private schools, and much more. This program presents the 6 principles of I.D.E.A., takes a close look at Individualized Education Plans, or IEPs, outlines what happens in an IEP meeting, and names the roles of the IEP team members.
You will learn the background, insight, and strategies to help you take I.D.E.A. from paper to practice.
I.D.E.A. sets high standards for achievement and guides how schools provide special services in order to meet the individual needs of students with disabilities. As a teacher in an inclusive classroom, it is important to know the basics of I.D.E.A. so that you know what is expected of you and your school.
The I.D.E.A. law contains 4 major parts. Part A outlines the general provisions of the law and defines specific terms. Part B describes the way that I.D.E.A. is funded. Part C describes early intervention services for infants and toddlers. And Part D describes national activities to improve education of children with disabilities.
The 6 basic principles which govern the education of special needs students are zero reject, non-discriminatory evaluation, appropriate education, least restrictive environment, procedural due process, and parent and student participation.
The first 4 principles of I.D.E.A. are the steps by which students receive their education. They ensure that students get the free and public education to which they are entitled. The last 2 principles are safeguards to ensure that the first 4 steps are executed properly.
Let's start with zero reject. I.D.E.A. was designed so that no child is denied a free public education. In other words, we reject the idea that a child cannot be educated due to a disability. For the purposes of I.D.E.A., a child includes anyone from age 3 to 22. Students with the most severe disabilities must not be excluded. Students with behavior problems caused by a disability must not be excluded. Even children with contagious diseases must not be excluded.
The second principle is non-discriminatory evaluation. This principle has 2 parts. First, schools are required to determine whether or not a child has a disability. And second, if the evaluation shows that a child has a disability, then the school's child study team or special education team will determine appropriate services that the student will receive. This team consists of appropriate clinicians, such as a social worker, school psychologist and/or specialized therapists, teachers, a school administrator, and parents. If the child is found to have one of the I.D.E.A. disabilities, he or she is eligible for special education and related services. A team must meet within 30 calendar days after a child is determined to be eligible.
Non-discriminatory evaluation leads to the next principle, appropriate education. Under this principle, each student will have an individually designed plan, or IEP, with specific measurable goals. These goals will be based on objective and subjective evaluations.
And what appropriate education looks like for someone who's 6 is very different for a child who's 16. So, it helps a child transition from grade to grade in that it scaffolds a child for the needs of the next grade.
An IEP is a written document. It lists the special educational services a child will receive, as well as how they will be implemented. A team develops the IEP, and you are a part of that team.
Once the IEP has been created, the school moves on to providing the next principle, least restrictive environment, or LRE. To meet this principle, the school will provide a learning environment that is as inclusive as possible. Here, they will learn alongside their typically developing peers to the maximum extent that is appropriate. This model of delivery is the most beneficial for both students with and without disabilities.
Inclusion is important because we all want to be included, and we all want to be accepted, and we all want to matter.
It used to be known as mainstreaming. It is now known as inclusion into general education. General education refers to academic curriculum, extracurricular activities, and even non-academic activities like recess and transportation. Least restricted environment should be the goal for all special education students. This provides a learning environment that most resembles that of their regular education peers. A student with a disability may be placed in a regular education classroom with or without an instructional aid. His inclusion can foster a sense of belonging, as well as promote understanding and compassion from his typically developing peers.
Well, the goal of an inclusive environment is to create an environment that meets the needs of all the children in the classroom. If all the children are being physically active in a certain way, that to the extent that their ability would allow them, they're also active in that way. If all of the children are working on a particular kind of lesson, that there's adaptations and accommodations so that they have access to those same experiences. So that the environment includes them as opposed to them being outside of the environment.
These 4 principles are the steps through which students receive the education that will best accommodate their needs and help them achieve their potential. The final 2 principles ensure that the first 4 principles are followed properly.
The 5th principle is procedural due process. This is a rule that makes the school and parents accountable to each other for carrying out the principles of I.D.E.A. If there is a dispute between parents and the school, the law provides a system to resolve the issue in question. I.D.E.A. strongly suggests mediation before lawyers are called in on either side. Ideally, the special education team will stress collaboration with the students' parents. Disputes that are not handled well can take away from a positive working relationship.
The 6th principle is parent and student participation. In addition to being a part of the IEP team, parents have other rights under I.D.E.A. For example, if the parents disagree with the initial evaluation of their child, they have the right to take their child for an independent educational evaluation, or IEE. They can ask that the school system pay for this. Other rights include access to school records for their child, as well as control over who else may view these records, and the opportunity to participate in special education advisory committees. The student also has rights under this principle. They must be informed of the rights they will have when they become an adult.
Let's review what we've learned in this section. I.D.E.A. is based on 6 principles.
Zero Reject states that all children, regardless of their disability, have a right to a free and public education.
Non-discriminatory evaluation requires schools to determine what each student's disability is and how it relates to the child's education.
Appropriate education ensures that all special education students have an IEP that suits their strengths and needs.
Least restrictive environment requires that students with disabilities be educated to the maximum extent appropriate alongside their typically developing peers. Procedural due process puts forth procedures that make the school and parents accountable to each other and describes how disputes should be handled.
And finally, parent and student participation outlines additional rights that parents and students have under the law. Now that we know the principles that make up the law, let's find out how children are identified as needing services under I.D.E.A.
Children may be identified as needing special services under I.D.E.A. in various ways. Through early intervention services or the Child Find System, as well as parents and teacher referral.
Some children receive services before they enter preschool. I.D.E.A. calls for early intervention services for children 0 to 3 years of age. Early intervention services are specialized health, educational, and therapeutic services designed to meet the needs of infants and toddlers who have a developmental delay or disability.
Sometimes it is clear from the moment a child is born that early intervention services will be essential in helping the child grow and develop. Even before heading home from the hospital, parents may be given a referral to their local early intervention office.
Other children may have a routine entry into the world, but may develop more slowly than others, experience setbacks, or develop in ways that seem very different from their peers. For these children, a visit with a developmental pediatrician and a thorough evaluation may lead to an early intervention referral. Early intervention for children aged 0 to 3 is concerned with all the basic skills that babies typically develop during the first 3 years of life.
When a child under 3 years of age is diagnosed with a disability, they are referred to an early intervention specialist. They work with the family to create an Individualized Family Service Plan, or IFSP. An IFSP is a document that highlights family involvement and specifies the early intervention services provided to infants and toddlers with disabilities. The IFSP is altered to become the child's IEP when they enter school.
Now, let's examine how children are referred for special education testing once they enter school. School-aged children are identified as needing services through Child Find, through a referral from school personnel, as well as their parent.
I.D.E.A. requires all states to have a comprehensive child find system to assure that all children who are in need of early intervention or special education services are located, identified, and referred.
States conduct child find activities, which are designed to find students in need of services. Such activities include running public awareness campaigns, conducting screenings to identify preschool children with special needs, and assisting state and local agencies with the identification process. The school system may ask to evaluate a child based on a teacher's recommendations, observations, or results from academic testing. A school may recommend that a child receive further screening or assessment to determine if he or she has a disability and needs special education and related services. When the school personnel or Child Find identifies an individual as a candidate for special education, their parents will be asked for permission to evaluate them.
Parents are often the first to notice that their child's learning, behavior, or development may be a cause for concern, and they may also request that their child be evaluated. Under the federal I.D.E.A. regulations, an evaluation must be completed within 60 calendar days after the parent gives consent. However, if a state's I.D.E.A. regulations give a different timeline for completion of the evaluation, the state's timeline applies. Evaluation should be administered in a way that doesn't discriminate and should use assessments that are based on norms of the child's peers. Assessments may evaluate academics, adaptive behavior, communication skills, motor skills, social and emotional skills, and intelligence. If the assessment determines the child will benefit from special education services, a formal plan will be created for the child in the IEP process. If there are disagreements during the assessment and evaluation, any party may initiate the formal resolution process.
Let's review how the I.D.E.A. process begins. I.D.E.A. has provisions to service even the youngest children, age 0 to 3 with special needs.
An ISFP helps parents and therapists identify a child's strengths and needs. It outlines a plan for the services that are most beneficial to them before they enter preschool.
School-aged children can be identified as needing special services through Child Find activities, parental referral, or school personnel referral.
Every beginning has an ending. I.D.E.A. also provides guidelines for how students with special needs can transition into adulthood. This transition planning becomes formalized as part of the student's IEP.
Now, let's take a closer look at the portion of I.D.E.A. that most directly affects your classroom, the Individualized Education Plan, or IEP.
Every child who receives special education services must have an IEP. An IEP is a written statement for a child with a disability. It is developed, reviewed, and revised in a formal meeting in keeping with specific legal regulations and requirements.
The process of developing this vital document is of great interest and importance to educators, administrators, and families alike. As a teacher, you will be playing a major role in the development of the IEP, but you'll be playing an even more significant role in the execution of the IEP.
You are part of the IEP team and have intensive day-to-day interaction with the student. You play a key role in the implementation of the IEP goals and objectives.
The general ed teacher is usually with the IEP student the most, so they play a big role at the IEP meeting. They know the curriculum, they know what modifications and adaptations that they've made in the classroom in order to make it successful for the IEP student. They usually start off the meeting by giving us an update where the child is in the areas of math and reading. Those are usually the two identified areas of weakness. They also let us know how the child is able to focus in the classroom, if they're doing the work that everybody else is being asked to do, how much modification needs to be done, what kinds of help are coming into the classroom, and is that helping the child, having the speech therapist come in or an occupational therapist come in.
and so they have a sense of, the bridge between home and school as well. And so they're really in a position to lead the team in saying, okay, this is what makes sense here, and this is something we need to look at differently. So when they are comfortable in that role, and when the rest of the team respects them in that role, I think that they're really able to provide a richness to the conversation that otherwise isn't there.
Here again, collaboration is key. This team has several members. It is important to keep in close contact with them from the very beginning of the process.
In this chapter, we will learn the purpose of the IEP, who makes up the IEP team, how it is written, as well as its various components. The IEP has two general purposes: to establish measurable annual goals for the child, and to spell out the special education, supplementary aids, and related services of the public agency will provide to or on behalf of the child. A team of people develops the IEP.
So, who makes up the team? The child's parent or guardian. At least one of the child's general education teachers. At least one of the child's special education teachers. A representative of the public agency. The law specifies that this person shall be qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of children with disabilities. In a larger school, this is often a teacher, supervisor, or assistant principal. In a smaller school, it may be the principal. The special education director of the school district can also fill this role. This person should be knowledgeable about the general education curriculum and availability of resources of the agency they represent. Another member is an individual who can interpret evaluation results and their instructional implications. This is often the school or district psychologist. Team members will also include other individuals who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child. Perhaps the child's occupational, speech, or physical therapists. A child's psychiatrist can also fill this role. Parents may also invite other stakeholders or representatives. These people may include a child advocate or therapist who see the child outside of the school setting. The child can be part of their IEP team. The IEP team decides if this would be the best for the child, often first addressing the issue in the junior high or high school years.
At the high school level, not only do they have the resource teachers that work with them academically, but they all have advisors. And all of the advisors have resources at their fingertips to help the parents and the child. And by that time, because they're old enough, the student is now actively involved in their planning, what kinds of classes they're going to take, what their career track might look like, so that they can pick classes that won't be foreign to them if they do decide that they're going to go on to college. What kinds of classes are available to them, and what kind of accommodations that they can meet. Even at the college level, they're making accommodations for students with all kinds of disabilities.
As a child gets older and become an adolescent, they're still thinking about the next grade, but they're also thinking a lot more about independent living. And so the IEPs, a couple different things happen. They start to include the child more actively in the IEP, and they start thinking about things like vocation and career as part of the IEP process.
This team will assemble for a meeting to discuss the child and create the IEP document. This IEP meeting must be held within 30 calendar days after it is determined, through a full individual evaluation that a child has one of the disabilities listed in I.D.E.A. and needs special education and related services. IEP meetings must happen annually until a student no longer has an IEP.
We're mandated to take a look at least once a year to see where they're at with either academically, social-emotionally, going over progress monitoring, how they've been doing with the interventions we have in place, and determining does that child still need the support once they've been identified.
The IEP broadly considers the child's involvement and participation in three main areas of school life. 1, the general education curriculum. 2, extracurricular activities. 3, non-academic activities.
As the child's teacher, I.D.E.A. expects that you will help to determine appropriate positive behavioral interventions, supports, and other strategies for the child. They identify which supplementary aids and services, program modifications, and support for school personnel are needed. These help the child progress toward attaining their annual goals.
Classroom educators are expected to help the student make progress in the general education curriculum. You may be called upon to adapt the curriculum, provide reading materials written at a lower reading level, or use graphics along with written materials.
Everything gets modified so that they don't feel like they don't understand what's going on in the classroom. It could be where they get pre-taught vocabulary so that when the actual discussion comes up, they can raise their hand, they can actively participate with the classroom. They are also able to participate in the regular PE or gym setting.
We have children that are in wheelchairs, cerebral palsy, autistic children come in the classroom. So accommodations do have to be made. It's in my planning before the children will arrive into physical education class that I'll plan and I'll think that lesson through. Again, that student is going to be fully involved during the day, and that's what they want and that's what they need. So they're going to be as physically active as they can, but they definitely are going to be active during a physical education class of mine.
Teachers are also expected to help students interact with their peers, including other children with disabilities, as well as those who are not disabled. The school may also be required to provide assistance with extracurricular activities and other non-academic pursuits.
Let's review what we've learned in this section. Every child that receives special education services has an IEP that is written by a team of individuals. This document establishes goals for the child and describes the related services that child will receive.
The IEP team is made up of parents or guardians, general education teachers, special education teachers, public agency representatives, psychologists, therapists, and sometimes the child themselves.
As an IEP member, classroom teachers may be called upon to determine the appropriateness of interventions and supports, identify modifications, help the student make progress in the curriculum, and assist with peer interactions. Now let's take a look at exactly what information is in an IEP.
We have seen that the IEP is an important tool for each child that receives special education services. In this chapter, we will examine the specific components of an IEP. The IEP includes performance levels, goals and objectives, services, a student schedule, assessment decisions, an overall timeline, and details of how to measure the student's progress towards their goals.
First, let's look at performance levels. These are the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Here, the idea of performance goes beyond classroom performance and may include standardized reading and math scores along with an IQ score. This information describes how the child is currently doing in school. It is also used to evaluate how the child's disability affects their involvement and progress in the general curriculum.
Next, the IEP team specifies annual goals, what the team believes the student can reasonably accomplish during the next year. For the sake of all those involved in the process, it is important to make goals achievable and specific. Here's an example. Michael will increase his reading comprehension. This goal is pretty vague because there are so many aspects of reading comprehension. How about this version? Michael will be able to answer the 5 W's 70% of the time after reading a paragraph of appropriate grade level. This goal is specific and measurable. It ensures that it is performance level appropriate.
The team also includes specific objectives in the plan. What's the difference between a goal and an objective? A goal is what you want to see change in 1 year's time. An objective is a specific skill that can be practiced in order to reach an overall goal. For example, Michael will clarify meaning by skimming, scanning, and reading carefully. Here are some tips for helping the team write goals and objectives. Keep in mind the student's current level of achievement. Make the goals achievable. Relate the goals to your curriculum. Make sure that goals and objectives are easily observed and measured.
After goals and objectives are established, the team decides how to create an environment that will provide the student the best chance of achieving these goals. Specifically, the team will decide which special education services will be provided and what accommodations will be made. These may include speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. Sometimes the team will decide that an instructional aid is appropriate.
Next, the IEP team will take a look at the student's school day schedule. They will determine if the student should be educated separately from non-disabled children, and if so, during which parts of the day. They will also decide if the student should or should not participate in extracurricular or other non-academic activities, such as lunch, recess, or after-school clubs with their typically developing peers.
When discussing the student's daily schedule, remember to only commit to that which you can reasonably and regularly achieve, and ask yourself these questions. 1. Are there specific subjects that present special challenges? If so, is the general education classroom the least restrictive environment during these times?
Number 2, what special relationships does the child have with particular students or teachers? It is important for their development and learning to have access to those relationships throughout the day.
3. How can the child's routine be maintained? It is important that the child have predictability and consistency.
Number 4, are there times of the day that present a special challenge for the child?
5. Are there accommodations that can be made within the classroom without removing the child from the general classroom?
Number 6, are there clubs or other extracurricular activities that are a motivator for the student? The importance of extracurricular activities is often forgotten for special needs children. It is essential to their development to be able to be with peers during out-of-school time.
Next, the team will discuss assessment. They determine how and if the child will participate in state and district-wide assessments. Sometimes a child will qualify for testing modifications, which makes the test and testing environment more suitable for student success.
In some cases, a child will receive accommodations in test taking, such as reducing the number of tests, reading the directions to the child, simplifying the language of the directions, reading the questions to the child, allowing the child to use a calculator, waiving points taken for misspelling words, and allowing for more time for tests.
The team will establish a timeline. This states when modifications will begin, how often they'll be provided, where they will be provided, and how long they will last.
Another major component of the IEP is measurement, or establishing how school personnel will measure the child's progress toward goals of the IEP. The IEP goes beyond academic concerns. Behavior is also a factor.
What if a student has behavior problems that interfere with her learning or the learning of her classmates? The IEP team must include strategies to address that behavior, including positive behavioral interventions.
Here are some examples of planning strategies, supports, and interventions to assist with behavior concerns. Provide visual aids with appropriate behaviors. Have clear and easy to understand expectations. Work toward a goal if behavior expectations are met. Clearly state rules and consequences. Follow through on the consequences. Let's review.
There are 8 main components to an IEP document: performance levels, goals and objectives, services to be provided, schedule of the student's day, decisions regarding assessment, a timeline, and criteria upon which progress toward goals will be measured.
The IEP meeting involves a large and diverse group of individuals, each of whom have their own opinion and judgments. Disagreements are inevitable. Most can be resolved during the meeting.
Usually if we know that there's going to be a dispute, we try first with just the classroom teacher, the special ed director, and the parent. Talk to the parent just to see what is it exactly that they're not comfortable with, what's in the plan, and we really try to accommodate what the parent needs are at that point first, before we even get to a point where we're at due process.
However, some disputes will involve the due process portions of I.D.E.A.
For example, let's say that a child's IEP included a provision for classroom visits from a particular therapist. The school provided an appropriate therapist, but it was not the individual discussed at the IEP meeting. When the child began to show regressive behaviors in class, the parents felt it was a result of the child not seeing the originally agreed upon therapist.
To initiate the resolution process, parents fill out and file a due process complaint. This includes a description of the problem that the child is having, as well as a proposed resolution to the problem.
The next step is the resolution process. It begins with a face-to-face resolution meeting with an impartial mediator. Here, the IEP team sits down and discusses how the needs of the child are being met. This must happen within 15 days of when the due process complaint was filed. They discuss why the therapist was chosen and the methods she's using with the student.
Then specific concerns are addressed. The teacher gives her input about what is happening during the therapy times and how that seems to be affecting the student's behavior and progress. An impartial mediator facilitates this discussion and makes suggestions regarding how to improve the situation or aspect of the IEP that is in dispute. All discussions during this meeting are confidential and cannot be used as evidence in a due process hearing or civil court case. These meetings should conclude within 30 days, unless agreed upon by both parties. If a mutual decision is made, then actions are put in place to make any necessary adjustments to the child's IEP.
If no agreement is reached during the resulting meetings, a due process hearing is scheduled. This must happen within 45 days of the conclusion of the resolution process. A due process hearing is an administrative quasi-judicial hearing, somewhat like a courtroom trial. Here, lawyers can represent parents and the school, as well as call and cross-examine witnesses. An impartial hearing officer presides at this hearing. Their decisions have the effect of law and are binding upon all parties involved.
There are instances where the local education agency may file a due process complaint. In these cases, the same procedures and timelines apply.
Next, let's leave the law behind for a moment and examine specific ways that you can take these I.D.E.A. components from paper to practice.
Throughout this program, we discuss the principles of I.D.E.A. Now let's look at some specific strategies you can use with your students. The principle of zero reject can be put into practice in your classroom by adopting a truly inclusive mindset.
Learn as much as you can about your student's specific special needs. Get to know your student as an individual beyond his or her disability. Be willing to try new approaches in working with students with special needs. Recognize the contribution that the special needs student can make in helping you develop a more diverse classroom. Now, let's look at a non-discriminatory evaluation.
If you have a student in your classroom that you feel should be referred for special education services, what should you do? Monitor the child and keep detailed records as to your concerns. Document specifics, such as what the child does, the time of day, the duration of behavior, the effect on other children, and interventions that you have tried. Keep work products that you feel illustrate your concern. Contact the school principal and social worker. Let them know that you have a concern and will be beginning a documentation process. Talk to the child's parents about your concerns and the documentation you are creating.
This parent-teacher collaboration is a crucial part of your role. Referring a child for services can result in a negative response from parents. So here are some tips for starting collaboration off on a positive note. Let parents know that you are not trying to build a case, but rather that you are trying to better understand the child's needs. You could invite parents to help by starting a similar process at home. Assure the parents that you still see the student as a whole child who simply may have a specific learning need.
Next, we have appropriate education. Your actions and attitude during the IEP meeting can make a big difference in the way the team works together. Convey to the other IEP team members an acceptance and willingness to actively participate in the IEP process. Learn strategies to effectively communicate and collaborate with the other team members. Here are some ways you can ensure that you are doing your best to help both the IEP team and your student. Record descriptive information about the child's progress in terms of the IEP goals. Advocate for the child by giving feedback about how realistic the intervention strategies are. Communicate the child's successes and progress to the team. Ask other members of the team what else can be done with regard to assistance.
It is crucial to communicate to the rest of the team what resources you need to help the child understand the general curriculum and achieve the goals listed in the IEP. This information can contribute directly to making decisions about what type of supplementary aids and services the child may need.
Let's take a look at least restrictive environment. This is not something you can create, but rather an environment that has been chosen as the best placement for the student. However, here are 2 general tips to create a classroom environment that sets your student up for optimum learning. Keep in close contact with the child's inclusion facilitator to see what type of seating is preferred. Work with the facilitator to find ways to create a calming classroom environment.
Although every student and every disability is different, there are some steps you can take to help your special education student that will also benefit your regular education students. Encourage students to keep a clear workspace. Keep your classroom organized. Use visual aids to help students remember expectations. Post a clear daily schedule and behavior expectations. Make sure all classroom materials are easily accessible.
In this program, we learned about the federal law known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. We learned how it is organized and which disabilities it covers. It is based on these 6 principles: zero reject, non-discriminatory evaluation, appropriate education, least restrictive environment, procedural due process, and parent and student participation.
I.D.E.A. has provisions to service children as young as 0 to 3 with early interventions. It includes students all the way through 22-year-old individuals that benefit from special education services.
Child find activities, school personnel referrals, or parental referrals are the ways in which school-aged children begin the process of receiving special education services. Each student who receives these services has an IEP which was written by a team and considers
performance levels, goals and objectives, services to be provided, schedule of the student's day, decisions regarding assessment, a timeline, and criteria upon which progress toward goals will be measured.
An IEP must be reviewed annually.
As a classroom teacher, you play a very important role within the IEP team, but most importantly, to all of the students in your classroom.
They begin to understand difference. They begin to understand how differences pose challenges, but also how people deal with those challenges, which is beneficial for them in terms of understanding the world that they live in, but it's also beneficial for helping dispel any sort of stereotypes or ideas they might have about how differences might preclude you from being able to accomplish things in this world. And again, that's the idea of public education.
I.D.E.A. was written in order to provide students with an education who might otherwise be forgotten. Over the years, school districts have made strides to improve the education of students, both with and without disabilities. With the help of your school's special education team, you will find having students with disabilities in your classroom will provide both you and your students with valuable learning experiences.
And applying the suggestions made here, especially focusing on your role as a collaborator, you can successfully take the I.D.E.A. law from paper to practice.